It's a great honor to be speaking here, and I'm really nervous, and that hasn't been for a long time, so that's a good sign, I think. And yes, I'd like to have a look with you what we do with the E in the CFR, and as Neos already said, I'm not the first one to have proposed that. It was our dear Jamie who said that in 2016, and I think it was at Lancaster at one of their research colloquiums. Is it time to take the E out of the CFR? And so this talk is dedicated to Jamie, and I hope he's going to be with us on the little journey around the globe that I'm going to do with you the next 45 minutes. So my focus will be on the impact of the CFR on all regions but Europe. We're not looking at Europe, because Barry has done that already. And I managed to get 33 participants, some of them in the room, to tell me about the impact of the CFR in their region on education, on teaching, learning and assessment, and on perhaps the future influence the CFR may have. Many thanks to all of you who shared your insights, and many thanks to Carol Spettel, who can't be here. We sat on a Sunday afternoon on her sofa mulling over the interview questions, and that was the Sunday that we spoke and saw Jamie on WhatsApp last, and he was bright and breathy and looking really healthy and really well, and we had lots of ideas and plans, so they will live on in our hearts. And then I thought we'd do a literature search to complement the interviews and see whether that chimes with what's written. And thanks to my student assistant Isabel Newey, she was really helpful here, and participants gave me more references, so I have 69 publications on the impact or introduction of the CFR, and we just looked at the past 12 years, we're not going further back. And of course there are limitations, see this as a work in progress. I did a convenience and snowball sampling, and the focus was on assessment, so the colleagues may not have insights in all aspects of the educational systems in their regions. And it's a snapshot with many blind spots, but it's as comprehensive as I could get it in 3 or 4 months. And any regions not yet on a map doesn't mean the CFR isn't used, it just means I don't yet have insights. So if you happen to nobody or know about a region, here I am, let me know. Now, first of all, where do my interview participants come from? And all in green are the regions and the countries that I managed to get some information. And many thanks to our student assistant, Emily Kunush, for coloring the map in. That was a real great task. I couldn't have managed without her. So this is the regions where the interview participants come from, and this is where the literature refers to. So you see there is some overlap, some additional complementary. So I got quite a nice overview. Now, what did I do with all these data? I first had a look and described the different areas. I'll talk a little bit about that. There's super interesting insights which I can't all share because we don't have the time today. And then I looked at emerging themes, what came out of the data. And one of the things I realized is, at least for me, looking at a historical perspective from the past to the present, I saw 5 major approaches, and that's work in progress. One is not applicable. The CFR is not applied in these regions. I couldn't discern any influence, but mind my limitations. The second approach are the crosswalkers, and many thanks to one of my participants to give me that term, that coin that term, And the crosswalking means looking historically pre-CFR dating frameworks that existed before the CFR came into life, and they have now been aligned or compared. So this is a kind of a crosswalk because they're not comparable in all areas and all dimensions. It's CEFR and the Canadian language benchmarks mainly. And then we have the adopters. Adopting means you use the CFR as a broad framework of reference. Very often the CFR is reduced to the levels and the global scale. And you find alignment of curricula, of tests, of educational standards. You find it all around the globe, and I'll show you in a minute where this happens mainly. And then we find those who dive a little bit deeper, and they adapt the CFR. And by adaptation, I mean they use the CFR framework, the whole level and scale system. They adapt the levels, they adapt the descriptors, develop a localized framework. And that happened, for example, with the CFRJ in Japan, in Taiwan. In Qatar, they actually developed the CEFR, a framework for the Arabic language as L1, really interesting. And in Chile, they adapted the CFR for a teacher education framework. So they go a step further. They make it local, they localize it to suit the local contexts. And then we find what I coined the DYO, do it your own, do your own. And that means you may have looked at all the available frameworks and decided they don't fit my context. So I developed my own framework, and that, for example, happened in mainland China with the Chinese standards of English. And then they, of course, can be back-aligned or compared to the CFR. And these categories are not mutually exclusive. Yeah, we'll come back to that. But first, I thought I'll take you on a global journey and make it a bit more detailed and interesting. This is where you find the main approaches in the different regions. And of course, this is too small to see. So let's zoom in and start with the Americas. Let's start from north to south without implying any means of importance. If we look at the North Americas, we find in red the crosswalkers, as I said, CTEFL and the Canadian language benchmarks. Those frameworks kept their influence, and the CTEFL guidelines were compared to the CFR. That's where the crosswalking comes from. In Canada, the Canadian language benchmarks were recently aligned. North and Picardo have written that up. And interestingly, the CFR has mainly influence in Canada on those regions where French is spoken as second language. I found that interesting. When we then move further down to the Caribbean and the LATAM areas, we find adopters, adapters, and do your own. And the CFR labels in that region are widely known. They have impact, mainly on the English as a foreign language sector. And here we find influence via international tests, international publishing companies, and the stance towards the CFR varies from adopters, embracers, yeah, let's look to Europe for education, all the way to critical stance, this is European imperialism, we don't want that. So it's a very diverse picture. And what's also interesting is that in some regions, participants said English is preferred over local indigenous languages, so they're at risk of losing out. That's an interesting aspect that we should not forget. And we find, of course, huge regional differences. This is a huge region, even within the partly huge countries, you find huge regional differences. I give you just some examples. In Cuba, where I have a little bit of insight, the Ministry of Education for Higher Education adopted the CFR, the levels, and then they handed it down bottom up to curriculum development and test development, which is then adapting the CFR. So that's why it's an adopt-adapt approach. In Mexico, the CFR was adopted for the National English Program, and then they developed the CENI standards. They are kind of adopting the CFR, but they're kind of standalone, their own thing, and they're used for different purposes in different regions of Mexico. So hugely varying picture. In Brazil, apparently the CFR doesn't have any influence. It's rather a critical stance from what I know, but there may be different information out there. And they have their guidelines for bilingual education, meaning Portuguese and English, and they were released in 2020, apparently with no reference to the CFR. In Chile, as I already said, they adapt the CFR bottom up. They developed some local universities, the teacher education curriculum. And that's as far as I go into that area for the moment. Let's move on to Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. As I said, we are not looking at Europe. And Africa, there is hardly anybody mentioning the CFR. I didn't find any publications. I had two informants who said there is no influence, and it may be due to the colonial past. Why use a European framework for languages? So I'm still waiting for more information here. The Middle East, the Gulf region, is a really interesting region. There is partly adaptation, but mainly it's done top-down. The CFR is rather welcome. I didn't hear any critical voices. That doesn't mean that they're out there, I just didn't hear them. It has been translated to local languages, to Hebrew, to Arabic, and it's mainly in the English foreign language sector, the influence, again, via bringing in international teachers, international textbooks. Many of the universities, particularly in the private sector, have adopted international tests for higher education entrance. So that's where the CFR labels come in. And in Qatar, Emirates, Oman, and Egypt, some institutions, private institutions in Egypt, they adopted the CFR for the EFL curriculum. Some still have their own system. And Israel is an interesting case. Bottom up, the CFR was introduced, and now what I heard is that the conference in Borig in 2014, there were scholars from Israel, and they got acquainted with the CFR there and brought it back to Israel. And now one of the researchers is in the ministry and has brought it back, and they adapted the CFR because it suits the multilingual context. And I thought, hey, maybe we do have some impact on education. And I really find the implementation process really interesting. So Levi Duva have written a really interesting article that I would recommend to read. And in Qatar, as I said, they have the CEFR, so it was adapted for L1 Arabic education, and it isn't comparable in all aspects, but it has served as a model, which I find really interesting. When we go to Central Asia, I have really limited insights. I find mainly adopters. I have insights from Uzbekistan. The English standards are aligned to the CFR, and there are plans to adopt it for L1 Uzbek education. So that's interesting. And I have only one informant for the whole of Russia. There seems to be a new standardized high school exam that targets B2. And in India and Bangladesh, I have 3 interview participants, and they say there is no influence. Not on the curriculum, not in the classroom, but of course the labels are known via the international tests. So that's as much information as I have in this region. And if we move over to Asia, Oceania, and the Pacific, we have a very diverse picture here. Again, we start north to south. There's no influence in South Korea, Hong Kong, and Macau. The CFR doesn't have much influence there. In China, I already mentioned the Chinese standards of English. They analyzed all the existing frameworks, used whatever they could, and then they developed their own because they said none of the existing frameworks really suits their context. And the Chinese standards of English have been compared to the CFR. There's interesting research out by Konyam, Peng, and others. And we then find adapters. And here perhaps Jamie pops up again. You all know that he has worked for a long time in Japan. They adapted the CFR. It's the CFR-J, and it has now been back aligned to the CFR. Interesting research out there. And in Taiwan, they wanted to account for the local context, the use of English in this context, and the educational aims, and they also adapted it. And we have translations into Japanese, into the different varieties of Chinese spoken there. So it has influence in this region. And if we move further down to Southeast Asia, that's a really interesting context. I could talk a lot about this, but I can't given the time. That's really a vibrant, emerging educational context there. And what is interesting here for all the Asian countries is the pressure, the economic pressure that stands behind revising the English curriculum. And that seems to be a high pressure there. The CFR has a huge influence for the English as a foreign language sector. And also here it was mentioned the international publishers, the international exams. And there was reported a risk of losing the local ecologies of teaching, learning, and assessment on the cost of bringing in international materials. We do find translations, for example, in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, that CFR has been translated into the local languages. And in Indonesia, we find an interesting approach. They adapted the CFR descriptors in a qualitative way. And that's an interesting way of adapting the CFR without just referring to the levels. And if we move further down to Oceania, there is limited to no influence. In Australia, the CFR isn't used, and they use the IELTS bands for immigration purposes and for higher education entrance. And they have the ESL scales by Mackay for second language education, but apparently the CFR doesn't play a role down under. Bit different in New Zealand, the CFR has been adopted in a way. It has some influence on the curriculum and on the assessment criteria in the national assessment, but the impact in the classroom seems rather implicit. So on the other side of the globe, perhaps limited influence. So that was just a quick tour de force around the world. And let's go back to the 4 approaches, the 4 main approaches. And as I said, there is overlap. These are just categories that came up while I analyzed the data. And with the interview participants, we also discussed, where does adoption start? If you use the CFR to align your pre-existing framework, is that already an adoption of the CFR? And when does it turn to adaptation? Like if you adopt the CFR as a standard and then you adapt it to suit your local curriculum and develop localized tests, is that then adapted adoption? Where does one start and the other end? And when you look at adaptation or do your own framework, when is it adapted enough or so far adapted that it actually is not comparable with the CFR any longer directly? So this is my thinking at the moment. See that as a work in progress. That's not yet the end of my thinking. And then you come full circle. If you have your own framework and you compare it to the CFR, well, that's not different from the crosswalkers, which were coined because we looked prehistorically, pre-CFR. So that's my thinking at the moment. And what's the next step that we will explore together now is if we link different frameworks. Now, we heard this morning about linking an exam, and that's complex enough. But think of the complexity if you link different frameworks. That takes complexity a step further. So can the CFR be a link between other pre-existing frameworks or newly developed frameworks? And what's the role that CFR-aligned tests or items or samples play in this process? Now, luckily, I'm not the first one to have thought about that. North and Picardo, when aligning the CLB, the Canadian language benchmarks, they delineated 5 methods of aligning frameworks. So I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Many thanks to Brian and Enrica. So the first possibility is you use calibrated samples from 2 frameworks, ACTEFL tests and some CFR-aligned tests, and then you can have those items, tests, performances assessed by the other system and see and compare where do they log in, how do they compare. That's one possibility, and that was done with the ACTEFL and the CFR frameworks, and that's where the coin responsible crosswalkers comes from. But you do need strong evidence for the linking of the tests to the respective frameworks. So far, so good? Yeah. And then the other method, the second method, is you can have the descriptors from the 2 frameworks you want to align and do what Brian North did with the original CFR and also with the companion volume, have teachers assess, rate the descriptors, and maybe also have self-assessment by students. And then you can have a multifaceted rush analysis and bring it all on one scale and have a look whether they log in, how comparable are they. That has been done, for example, the back alignment of the CFRJ and also the comparison between the CSE and the CFR. So that's been done and practiced. Then another way of thinking is if I have the ACTEFL, for example, these are just examples. If I have ACTEFL aligned to the CFR and if I have the Canadian language benchmarks aligned to the CFR, can I then use the CFR as the medium of comparison? And again, you need super strong backing evidence for the alignments. So that would be a third method. And you could do a content comparison, what's really in their content construct comparison. But again, that's maybe rather subjective and you may want further evidence. And you could follow the manual and the handbook that we have heard earlier on this morning. And that's what North and Picardo did when they aligned the CLB to the CFR. And I just focus here on the specification stage. They did a content construct analysis, so they used method number 4. And then in the standardization phase, they used benchmarks that had already been calibrated to the 2 frameworks, and they used scales from both systems. And in standard setting, then they used calibrated samples. They were cross-assessed, and they had newer samples assessed by both systems, and they did that for English and for French. Now that's taking complexity to a whole new level. And they said they still need further evidence that's best to be followed by external validation. So a very complex endeavor, I would say. And when I read the articles and when I discussed aspects with my interview participants, what I realized, and also when I listened to presentations here, I realized there are some interpretations of the CFR that perhaps it's just me, I would not necessarily share. And there is one, that's the big elephant in the room, the CFR as the gold standard. We can have endless discussions. Is it the gold standard? Yeah, can it be the gold standard? And in some of the publications, standard was used in the meaning of high quality international standard. And you find kind of the implied meaning, if we use the CFR, we reach international standards. And that's for me a bit of a shortcut. And then sometimes you find CFR as a teaching or assessment method. Sometimes it's mistaken for the communicative approach. It has an action-oriented approach, sure, it's in the philosophy behind, but the CFR is not the method to teach or assess languages. Sometimes you find the CFR referred to as the test or the testing system, and that happens particularly in contexts where an educational reform was introduced by introducing a test. Of course, then you have the levels and you take the levels or the test as the CFR. And I find some conceptual misunderstandings of alignment, equating, benchmarking, CAT score with pass rate, standard setting. And given the complexity behind those concepts and the complexity behind the CFR, maybe that's a call for us as community. What can IATA do for assessment literacy? So maybe that's where we could start with a little course on what the CEFR is, can do and cannot do. And that brings me now to 3 big challenges that emerged from the data and that are also found in the literature. And one of the big challenges is the CEFR as an instrument, as an approach. It is, at points, misinterpreted, often reduced to the levels and the global scale, and it may be because of the complexity of the documents, of the concepts. We have super rich abundance of resources, which I really welcome. The Council of Europe, the ECML, the European Council of Modern Languages, they're working hard, they have super rich resources. But I try to access them with my students. Believe me, you need more than a semester to understand what's in there. It's hugely complex. So no wonder that people may reduce the complexity. That's our human brain, I think. And maybe we need to offer guidance to understand the philosophy behind and to navigate the documents and the resources, as one of my participants suggested. And another participant said similar things: make the CEFR and the core concepts accessible. Help users understand, for example, what is the meaning of a level? What does it mean to be at a level? The range of levels found in one class, the uneven profiles that we heard in the conference here within one learner, understand language attrition. You have been certified a level, how long is that valid if you have never spoken the language again? So these are super complex concepts that maybe we can make a contribution to make them clearer and more accessible. So that's one of the big challenges. That was the first one. The second challenge that I found has to do with the CEFR being perhaps at points used for the wrong reasons. It is an apparent ease of access if you just use the levels, the CEFR scale, and I'm like, what scale are you referring to? It's a quick fix to educational reforms, as Phillips 2004, not with reference to the CEFR, but the quick fix term comes from him, says. And it is sometimes understood as, well, that help us in a quick way to achieve international standards. But it's far too complex to do that. And Savsky asked the question whether the CEFR is a common currency or a political gatekeeping tool. And when I wanted to put the E in brackets, autocorrect suggested a euro sign, and I thought, yeah, actually there's a big money market behind it. So thanks, autocorrect. That's as much AI as I have in my slides. The rest is mine. So what many participants said, that there is a danger of losing the local teaching and learning approaches. The local textbooks may be exchanged by internationalized, globalized products. And I already mentioned the loss of local teaching, ecologies of teaching, learning, and assessment. And one of my participants said it has become a kind of neo-colonization. We have to buy textbooks that show the test scores in relation to the textbooks that show the CEFR levels. Yeah, you put a stamp on it, no matter how much CEFR is in there. You have tests that show the test scores in relation to the CEFR and etc. We still rely on Western standards. And I think that's something we do have to take very, very seriously. And that's also reverberated in Foley and Savsky calls this the McDonaldization. And I think that's a danger we should not underestimate. And the tension between the universalization, we want a harmonization, we want a standardization, we want a common currency. And on the other hand, we need localization, we need to adapt that framework. It doesn't work if you just use it as an assessment scale. It's not for assessment. So you have to do something with it. So that's a question, a tension that I would like to explore with you a little bit in more depth. So the universal standards versus the flexible meaning, as Savsky coined that. Again, another publication that I would like to draw your attention to. And I have some interesting examples from my participants on the universal standards and the flexible meaning. And we could critique that the CEFR is often adapted as a universal standard in a prescriptive way. But then we find some examples, like in Indonesia, they didn't use the levels, they didn't reduce it, they really went through adapting the descriptors. They have B1 at the end of secondary schooling, but that's as far as they go with the levels. So you can do it differently. There are examples around that it works in a localized way. And then the transparency and the labels. There was some interesting discussion with my participants. I have to say I really, really enjoyed that process. That was the best for a long time in terms of research I've done. That was really super interesting. And we know with the levels out there and the TEFL levels like beginner, advanced, superior, one of the participants, and it's not an ACTEFL-related participant, they said those labels have a hugely classifying effect for people. So that participant hoped that the CFR levels may be less classifying, going away from putting you in your superior, your advanced. And we find that also in Savsky, who sees the benefit of the CFR levels and descriptions in the transparency that it brings to language education, going away from beginner, advanced, superior. So there's some discussion around that actually the universal standards may be beneficial, the universalization, the harmonization. And if we want to go beyond the E, and now I'm referring to Europe and English, because most of the times the CFR is used for English, we find in Qatar the CEFR. We also find a recent development in Japan by the Ministry of Justice to aid foreign residents learning Japanese. There is now a reference framework for Japanese language education modeled on the CFR. So it is actually being applied to other languages and also L1 education. And there are the plans in Uzbekistan to use the CFR to look at Uzbek language proficiency. So there's some interesting development here around the universal standards. And then there's the general question that I don't have the answer, but I think, well, can a prescriptive use of a framework be avoided at all? And let's face it, once the descriptors are out, they will have a normative effect. And what I found interesting is one of my participants said, there is an advice for the Council of Europe: do not develop CFR tests that are then acknowledged as the CFR tests. We have ACTEFL tests. That's an approach the ACTEFL group has taken. And I'm not commenting on that. That's neither good nor bad. I don't want to critique that. But what I found interesting is the comment one of the participants made: if you don't have CFR-aligned tests, the CFR tests, that may be less proprietary and hence less prescriptive than ACTEFL. And that's one participant's opinion. And I thought, interesting. So, Council of Europe, let's not go there, perhaps. That's a point we could discuss. And looking into the future a little bit, there may possibly be more adopters, let's face it. Regions, countries look to what the neighbors are doing. If one adopts it, the next region may adopt it as well. And I heard from one participant that PISA from 27 onwards will assess English as a foreign language, and that will be aligned to the CFR. And they will focus on listening and speaking, as these are often neglected in the school context. And let's face it, that will have an effect. If PISA is adopting the CFR, you can guess where that's going. So there will be a necessary discussion around the common currency or the political gatekeeping here. Let's look a little bit into the flexible meaning of this dichotomy. I have two quotes for you. One is from Scott and East from New Zealand, and they say the open-endedness and the lack of prescription is a particular strength of the CFR. The lack of definition about what should be taught is commensurate with the open-ended and non-prescriptive nature of the new learning languages learning area in New Zealand. So they say, great, awesome. Then we have the other side of the coin, so to speak. Mohammed, in a recent publication, quoted Nagai and O'Dwyer and Picado et al. They warn against the many local, inconsistent interpretations of the CFR. They argue that having many adapted versions of the CFR may affect its validity. So you see the tension here, and that's huge. And I don't yet have an answer. And the big question, how to overcome local inconsistent interpretations while guarding the local ecosystems without imposing Western standards, that's a discussion we should have. And I have some implications in a minute or two. Let's face it, there are more challenges. The third one that came out of my data has to do with the empowerment of teachers. Is the CFR an instrument for teacher empowerment, or is it a vehicle for enforcement? And that's also chiming with what Savsky wrote. And we have teacher beliefs and practices, and we all know you teach and assess as you were taught and assessed. And any educational reform will take a long time in any case. And if you introduce the CFR, and that's often done top-down, you may find teachers who say, leave me alone. Yet another new invention, I am not buying in that. And then you have the textbook and the test influence in the classroom. We cannot underestimate that influence. So many participants mentioned that challenge in introducing any educational reform and also in introducing the CFR. And that's not really serving teacher empowerment. That's coming top-down. And then we face many local constraints in many different areas. We have limited resources. We have a limited availability of teachers. We have huge class sizes. And for example, that's just Argentina, Mexico, Vietnam, where that was reported. We have a lack of exposure to the communicative use of English. And the CFR describes actually language use in a second language context. You're there. And that doesn't hold true for Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam, for example. So they need different descriptors. That doesn't really fit their context and many other contexts. So we have to take that into account. And let's not forget the aforementioned complexity and accessibility issues with the CFR. So the big question is, how can we empower teachers? And I will explore that a little bit further, because what also emerged out of the interviews is the influence of different agents. And that I found really interesting. Exam boards. Of course, they may have a universalization influence that may be kind of an enforcement effect. But at least one participant said, when the exam boards are called in to the ministries for advice on setting educational standards, on doing education monitoring, they can actually have a beneficial effect on educating the ministries in their assessment literacy. So, is there anybody here from an exam board? That's a task for you guys. And for us as well, as a professional community. Then I already mentioned the international textbook publishers. Many participants mentioned that, and Safsky says this may have a disempowering effect on teachers and on the local ecology. And cultural institutes have an influence. The Goethe Institute, for example, was involved in translating the CFR in Japanese and Hebrew and maybe other languages. The British Council supports many English language education projects all across the world. So that may be beneficial, or it may be on the cost of fostering other languages. The resources are limited, but there is an influence that we should not neglect. And then we have individual agents. And that was really interesting to see in different contexts. For at least in Indonesia, Israel, Japan, and Vietnam, and other contexts as well, it was individuals having gotten across the CFR when they were at conferences or studied abroad, did their PhD, they brought it back, they found it interesting, they looked into it, they adopted it, they adapted it, and brought a reform suggestion to the ministry. So there are bottom-up movements, and individual agents can be playing a huge role. And this is at least two, if not three sides of a coin. I had an interesting discussion with Eric on the first evening here on the 2 or 3 sides of a coin. So we have to see the influence that different agents can have. It can go either way and many ways, but we need to take those agents into account when we're looking into educational reforms. And now I've talked fast enough to have time for the last 2 slides. That's great. I have 2 slides on takeaways, and they are packed with text, but I want to share what my participants shared with me. I have some takeaways for the policy dimension of CFR in implementation, and 2 participants were saying, the first one is, ask yourself right in the beginning, why do you want to introduce the CFR? Be very clear on the why and on the criteria of success for introducing the CFR, for using it in practice. And the why will then define the what and the how. And another participant said, define which aspect should be implemented and how. So you have to be very clear right in the beginning. Don't just adopt it as a quick fix. That doesn't work. And what one participant said, it's super important to have a dialogue among local practitioners, get teachers on board, educators, policymakers, and researchers. Have everybody around the table to get them on board. Then many participants, and also Foley, Dettel, and Mohammed, suggested a gradual, systematic introduction from the earliest stages onwards. Start with the principles behind the CFR, adapt the CFR to suit the local context. And yes, we will have to think then how to back align it to this original CFR, yes, but we need to take the local ecosystem into account and have an accompanying research agenda, as Little suggested. Have a communication strategy. Inform all stakeholders about the introduction, about the expected benefits, about what the CFR can do and what it cannot do, and include any harmful effects and potential dangers. Be clear about it right from the beginning. Communicate with everybody. And then I find references towards bottom-up and top-down. There's few people who would suggest a top-down or only a bottom-up. Most go into the direction use both. You need top-down ministry decisions, otherwise nothing will work, but you need to involve bottom-up the teachers, otherwise it'll never get into the classroom. And you find a really nice implementation documentation for Israel in Levy and Duval. And then, very, very, very important, allow time and have money. It's not going to work without. And one of my participants said, be prepared to manage change, from resistance to acceptance to adoption, and I would add adoption. You need time, you need patience, and you need the resources. And a very interesting suggestion that I would like to share with you, this chimes with what I think is have local standard setting exercises for international tests. Now don't grill me for that. Work with local experts. And the reason behind is that learner profiles for different L1s, different multilingual settings, differ hugely. There is no such thing as this is a B1 text. No, it isn't. Sorry, take me on this. I'll fight. Because I worked in Cuba and they showed me texts that they thought suitable for their B1 learners, and I look at it and it's full of Latin origin words, full of low frequency words. A German learner at B1 would never be able to understand this text, never. And they say, well, they're all the same words in Spanish and in English. And I'm like, oh, right, so is your B1 my B1? Certainly not in terms of the concrete features that a learner can process. So bear that in mind when you talk about this is a B1 text or a B1 word. No. Tell me for which context. And then, important, we need more exchange about neighboring regions and countries, and not just, are you adopting the CFR, which level are you at? No. Look into the local context, the local situations. How do you want to improve language education? What pitfalls are there with implementing the CFR? How can you localize the CFR? So have exchange across regions and borders. And then the big thing, and I don't have an answer to that really, I promised you wrong things in my talk. But I hope I laid the ground that we can have an informed discussion. You then have the CEFR. It has European values, it's often used for English. Then you localize it to your context, maybe to other languages. You adapt it, you localize it. We have many local versions. And I guess we have moved on from the question, well, is my B1 your B1? We all know it's difficult. We now talk about what's your B1 like. And then we have to find a way to have a global framework. And we have to find a way in Europe, critically, to reflect what European Western values are in that framework that may not apply to other regions. So there is a lot of thinking, I think, to be done, and I don't have the answer. It's not an easy answer, where we want to go with that. Last slide. Well, kind of last slide. Cool. I have some takeaways when we think of the CFR implication for teachers and teacher empowerment, which I really find important. Start locally, context sensitive. Start with teacher training, get teachers on board, encourage a critical, deeper level engagement with the CFR. Don't just use the CFR scale, whatever that may be. I'm not sure what people mean when they say the CFR scale. Raise critical awareness of language policies. What role do they have? And raise awareness of the crucial role of teacher agency and how you can actually empower teachers. And you see many participants said that. And I have super interesting ideas how you could do that. And one of the participants said, start big. Start with the teacher education program, courses on the history of the CFR and the Council of Europe, the content, the updated version, the philosophy approaches. The next participant said, no, start slow. Start with giving teachers a self-assessment scales. Let them self-assess themselves to experience what the CFR wants and can do. Then expand the limitation to the levels in the global scale to encompass the whole proficiency system, explain what it means to be at a level, explain uneven profiles, emphasize the open-ended nature, the need to interpret and adapt locally, spaces to be filled, guide the focus on the positive can-do approach. Where do we still count errors? Anybody here still counting errors? Oh, you. Oh, sure, Harry. So, guide the focus that the descriptors are not been prescriptive. Introduce activities, and I think that's really, really important. Introduce activities around feedback and self-assessment based on the CFR, and help teachers see how they can develop localized versions of tasks based on the CFR. So a lot of good ideas for teacher training, teacher activities, whether it's pre or in service. And then cascade the knowledge. Especially in large contexts, you cannot train everybody, but you can train multipliers and they go out and multiply the knowledge. What is crucial is that how the CFR has been reconfigured, adapted, localized in teaching and learning materials and in assessment materials, because that goes into the classroom and that will have impact in the classroom. So help teachers see how they can reconfigure the abstract, vague CFR descriptors into concrete activities suitable for their local context. Go into the classroom, observe, analyze practices, get the CFR out of the internet and the testing context, bring it into practice in the classroom, is what one participant said. And another participant said we need to explore alignment methods that are fit for the classroom. We are talking about test alignment, framework alignment, but really we have to now put the handbook, the newly released handbook, into practice. How can we help teachers to see whether they are operationalizing the CFR in the classroom activities? And have accompanying research, or help teachers get into classroom-based research, into action research. And then make the CFR resources equals EALTA resources more accessible, is what some participants said. And interestingly, 5 days ago, I attended an online meeting, the inaugural meeting of the API, the Association for Plurilingual and Intercultural Education. Brian North, Enrica Picardo, and many other colleagues were there. And there, the colleagues showed some recent development by the ECML, the European, Center for Modern Languages. And there is now the CFR quality matrix. And that will help teachers get into the CFR. You could say yet another resource to explore, but I haven't looked at it yet, but maybe that's a door into the CFR. So there's work going on to make it more accessible. And then for the higher education context, there is now an implementation toolbox for the companion volume. You can also find the toolbox at the ECML pages. So colleagues are working on making the documents more accessible and the approaches more accessible. And now I've talked enough, and I would now like give my heartfelt thanks to the interview participants. And you'll see, you may recognize some or many of them. It was really a pleasure talking to you guys, and I will share the video with you. It was really, really an interesting journey also for myself to see the many different insights. And it's not yet over, I hope. I hope there will be more interviews, and that I can get a more complete picture of what's going on around the world. So many thanks to all of you. And now it is time to say Gora mila mai aguif agas slon agawalya.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for a very enlightening presentation, for keeping the time. And now we're going to ask Barry and the other Irish people here to give you a CFR level.
Pre-A1.
Now, another opinion. Okay, any questions? Barry.
Do you think a global framework is even possible?
I don't think so.
Glad you said.
I don't think so. how and where would we start, but I think it's important to raise our critical awareness how much Europe is in the CEFR, and how can we perhaps reflect critically, are we imposing on other language contexts? Can we help making this a more an endeavor with a bit more critical awareness that the CFR isn't a quick fix? And maybe it's also a call to textbook publishers, don't just put a label on it. And also test publishers, show me your research, do it, align it, and we've seen examples of really good alignment projects, so it can be done. But I see the economy behind it, and maybe that should not be the driver, but then again.
Show me the stats.
Any other questions? Yes, Peter?
I have a comment. What you showed us as your understanding of implementing the framework is already very advanced, explicit, detailed. And when I think back to the 90s, I was lucky enough to be there where I were, and my boss, Günther Schneider. And I also was in touch with Joe Shields. And the framework would have been published without the scale descriptors.
Yes.
So what they intended was actually to provide a framework of reference that could help you to describe objectives, tests, whatever. And they provided that framework too. And you remember that the original version of the framework contains boxes where it says where, just about as I remember, where appropriate state, and then this and that, relating to what is described in the chapter. So the most basic understanding of the framework is to take this rational approach and analyze what you are trying to do, and then outline whatever that is you want to do using the dimensions within the framework. And then the second point is, they say we have a favored approach, that is the action-oriented approach. Do a needs analysis whenever you develop a program or a test, and then take the tasks within those communication needs and use those as the units of analysis. And based on that, you describe whatever you want to do.
And that would be the perfect approach. And the problem is perhaps the scales. As soon as you put the scales in there, global scale levels, that's it, people fall for that. And they don't, and I don't know whether it's gone even more complex with the companion volume, because who's ever going to go back and read the text chapters in the original CFR? So, yeah, I fully agree with you, Peter. That would be the way to use it. And I like that the original CFR states we are not here to give answers, we are here to ask questions. And that's why I really embrace that the guidelines of the ALTA are asking questions. You should reflect and have a good rationale for what you do, yeah.
And if I can add something to what Peter was saying, there's an example that illustrates your talking about tensions, because 1995, 1996, the framework, the CFR, was circulated and asking for opinion from different countries. And I was supposed to write a report from the Generalitat de Catalunya. And I recommended that the tables in the appendix might be perhaps in the text. And I wasn't the only one. There were many other people who recommended the same. So the same people who may feel that this is not what it should be, recommended to change it. So that's human life.
Yeah, we live and we learn.
Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment, and that is that certainly within the English language teaching sector in Australia, there was a large discussion in around 2007 with the governing body, English Australia. The options of adopting, adapting, or cross-working were all discussed, and at least amongst private language providers, English language centres within Australian universities, the CFR was warmly and fully embraced, and it's the framework that allows teachers from different centres to talk talk about their curriculum, their learning outcomes, and their assessments. Perhaps not in other sectors such as micronet, but definitely in ELT in Australia.
Thanks. Can we have an interview date?
We've got 6 minutes. Eileen.
Yeah. I don't know whether this is a question or not. I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate once again. By stating the known fact, first of all. I think CFR is based on a language understanding or language description that bases itself in systemic functional linguistics rather than structural linguistics. So it favors the description of language based on language functions rather than language structures. And this is what it is trying to promote in language teaching, learning, and assessment as well, describing the uses of language within certain contexts, in certain domains, at certain proficiency levels. I wonder how much of this philosophy, linguistic, and theoretical background of CFR can be adapted anywhere, or should it ever be adapted? Looking at certain language learning and teaching contexts, we know that this is not the approach, this is not the perception, no matter how much this is trying to be implemented. Therefore, how much are we going back and forth between structurally based language teaching and functionally based language teaching? If we look at what happens at local contexts in classrooms, and if we sort of favor the adoption of it into any framework that would be developed locally. Thank you.
Thank you. I may have not gotten across correctly. I'm not in favor of adopting it. I'm very much in favor of what Peter said. I was just describing what's happening.
No.
I'm not in favor of adopting. I'm in favor of looking at your local context, analyze your needs, be clear about the why. Why would you adopt it? Why? If you don't have a good reason, don't do it.
Which is
So-
what the CFR says.
Yeah. Use the CFR as a framework of thinking, of rational analysis, and if you come to the conclusion, it's not my thing, that's fine. I would not promote everybody has to adopt the CFR. No, there are contexts where it may not fit. And we have seen lots of approaches where local ecologies have been taken into consideration. And then the big question is this still an adaptation of the CFR, or is it your own framework? And that's perfectly fine. And I guess that's the way to go. And that's why perhaps we won't find a global framework apart from, and maybe there Peter comes in, the framework is the rationale behind, the thinking, the critical thinking, the analyzing of your context and what you need. And we have to go away from the levels and the descriptors. We have to go back to the original, and as you said,
the framed reminders.
Yeah.
The framed
Yeah,
reminders. That's what they are.
maybe that's the core that can be global.
Any other contribution, question? This time for a question and a half.
Sorry, there is a global framework. There's a global framework for reading, and there's a global framework for maths, for elementary, high school students, which they're trying to implement around the world.
Who? Who is who? Who is they?
The World Bank, you say?
The World Bank.
Yes.
Can we have a critical look at that? And
Well,
what they have in mind.
what they have in mind is by year 2030 that all kids will have a basic education in reading and maths.
Yeah.
And there are descriptors in many languages.
Is it reading in foreign second languages or the first language?
That is different.
It's both.
Depends on the country.
Just a
Judy.
question about PISA. Is that somewhere where it's going to have to be global? I'm not too familiar about the PISA. They're going to have to be global, aren't they?
It's next year, not 2027. It's next year.
next year.
Next year.
I mean, I don't know enough about it.
I heard that the participant who is apparently involved in it, that it's gonna go from 27 onwards, but let's see. And the big question will be, how will they adopt which kind of descriptors? How will they translate the CFR listening and speaking concepts into a global assessment? That will be really interesting. And how will they then, what items will they have that are not culturally biased, that function in all different societies? And what will that do towards a globalization of the English education?
You must interview Tony Green.
No, I haven't.
You must, for that.
I must interview.
Tony Green.
Oh, cool. Another interview. Thank you.
But there's a number of studies on DIF. And one of the studies on DIF was done before the European Survey of Foreign Languages. I don't know if somebody was involved here. And the outcome was that DIF was sort of, under the carpet for a while. Okay, any other? Yes,
I can have a comment in connection with PISA and global. Because my understanding is that it is...
Can you hear, Euro?
There is
Yes.
a relative label to the word global here, because PISA is not compulsory. So countries can actually choose to sign up. So again, we...
Yeah, that's an answer for Judith.
Yeah.
It's not compulsory.
So probably it's not going to be a global framework in that sense, but it's as close as can get. Whether good or not good.
Yeah. May I add something to that? I was involved in Surveyline because I was the director for 2 years. Yeah? And there we treated the languages involved symmetrically. We used 5 languages. And the first reaction of PISA is, this is not worthwhile. We will promote English. That's what English is. And this is, again, a little bit of a colonial attitude toward the world. And I think we have to be careful of that. Not to be engaged with very politically inspired...
Economically as well.
Yeah, because it's... you have first rank and second rank countries participating in...
Can you hear Norman?
Yeah. If you come from a country that's not OECD, you are second rank. And if you are from OECD, you are first rank, and you have a saying in the policy of the PISA project.
No. So it's past, I think. I think we should give you a round of applause. Thank you very much.